If you're so smart, then translate this. The millionaire laughed at the humble cleaner and she... Richard Coleman held the paper with a contemptuous smile on his lips as he watched Jessica Bennett clean the marble floor of his office. The 28-year-old cleaner worked in silence, focused on her task, when he decided to interrupt her work with a taunt that would change their lives forever. If you're as smart as you think, then translate this, Richard said, extending the document toward her. Jessica stopped scrubbing the floor and looked up, meeting the mocking gaze of the 32-year-old businessman. Her fingers tightened around the broom handle, but she kept her composure. There was something in his tone that deeply unsettled her, an arrogance she knew all too well. "Mr. Coleman, I'm just doing my job," she replied, trying to return to her cleaning. No. You're always eavesdropping on meetings, acting like you understand business. Prove to me you're not just another ignorant cleaner," Richard insisted, waving the paper in the air. The document was written in Mandarin, filled with complex characters that seemed to dance before Jessica's eyes. She knew Richard expected her to fail, expected her to bow her head and admit her ignorance. But something inside her refused to give him that satisfaction. "What's in this paper?" she asked, curious despite herself. "Her $2 million contract with a Chinese company. My translators charged a fortune just for a preliminary review. But you, who are as smart as you pretend to be, can surely do it for free, right?" Jessica felt her face flush. It wasn't the first time Richard had humiliated her in front of other employees, but this time there was something different about the taunt. There was a hidden urgency behind the sarcasm, as if he actually needed that translation. "I don't pretend to be anything, Mr. Coleman. I just do my job and listen when people talk," she replied, wiping her hands on her blue uniform. "Then prove it. Translate this contract, and I'll double your salary this month. If you can't, you admit in front of everyone that you're just another ordinary employee trying to show off." Silence hung heavy between them. Jessica looked at the paper again, seeing the strange characters that seemed like an impossible puzzle. She didn't speak Mandarin, but there was something familiar about those symbols, something that tugged at a distant memory from her childhood. "Fine," she said finally, reaching out to take the document. Richard laughed loudly, a harsh sound that echoed through the spacious office. The glass walls allowed other employees to watch from the hallway, and Jessica felt the weight of their curious stares. "Shall you have until tomorrow morning? And Jessica, when you fail, I want you to apologize publicly for thinking you're more important than you really are." He dropped the paper on the desk and walked away, leaving behind the scent of his expensive cologne and the feeling that something very important had just begun. Jessica was left alone with the document, her hands trembling slightly as she held it. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, she folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her uniform pocket. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of automatic tasks, but her mind was entirely focused on the challenge Richard had thrown at her. When she finally got home, a small two-room apartment in Queens, Jessica felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Her grandmother, Grandma Ruth, was watching TV in the tiny living room, her gray hair tied in a loose bun. At 75, she was the only family Jessica had, and the wisest person she knew. "How was work, dear?" asked Grandma Ruth without taking her eyes off the screen. "Complicated, Grandma. The boss gave me an impossible task just to humiliate me." Jessica recounted the incident as she prepared a simple tea for both of them. "Grandma." Ruth listened silently, nodding occasionally. When Jessica finished speaking, the elderly woman turned to her with a piercing gaze. "Show me that paper," her grandmother requested. Jessica pulled the document from her pocket and handed it to Grandma Ruth. The old woman's reaction was immediate and startling. Her eyes widened, and she held the paper with trembling hands, bringing it closer to her face as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Good heavens, where did you get this?" she whispered. "It's just a contract Richard wants me to translate." "Why, Grandma? Did something happen?" Grandma Ruth slowly rose from the couch and walked to an old cabinet in the corner of the room. From a dusty drawer, she pulled out an old shoebox filled with yellowed photographs and aged documents. Her hands sifted through the papers until she found what she was looking for. "Look at this, my dear," she said, showing a similar document also covered in Chinese characters. Jessica felt her heart race. The paper her grandmother held looked identical, the same script as Richard's contract. But how was it possible that her grandmother, a simple woman who had always worked as a housekeeper, had something like this? "Grandma, I don't understand. What is this?" "It's a long story, my dear, one I've kept for over 50 years waiting for the right time to tell." Grandma Ruth sat back down, the old document in her hands. Her eyes held a nostalgic gleam, as if seeing something far away in time. "When I was young, I worked for a Chinese family here in New York City, the Lius. They came to the United States in the 60s, fleeing trouble in China. Mr. Liu was a very educated man, good with business, but he didn't speak English very well." Jessica sat beside her grandmother, fascinated by the revelation. She had never heard this story before. "I picked up a little Mandarin working for them. Mrs. Liu taught me while I took care of the children. She said I had a knack for languages, that my mind soaked up words like a sponge." "But Grandma, why did you never tell me this?" "Because those were difficult times, dear. Mr. Liu was involved in important business, things I didn't fully understand back then. When they suddenly left the United States, they left some documents with me. They said someone would come for them one day, but no one ever did." Grandma Ruth carefully unfolded the old document, pointing to specific characters. "See here, this symbol means contract. This one means partnership, and this is the Liu family name." Jessica studied them closely, beginning to notice patterns in the symbols. There was something hypnotic about how the characters connected, as if telling a visual story. "Do you think you could teach me, Grandma? At least the basics." "I can try, dear, but it won't be easy. It's been so long since I practiced, and my memory isn't what it used to be." The two spent the entire night hunched over the documents. Grandma Ruth patiently explained the meaning of each symbol she could still recall, while Jessica scribbled notes in an old notebook. It was like piecing together a giant puzzle, where each fragment revealed a larger part of the mystery. By sunrise, Jessica had a basic grasp of some key characters. It wasn't enough to translate the entire contract, but it was a start. She glanced at the clock and realized she needed to get ready for work. "Grandma, thank you for helping me. This means so much to me." "Listen closely, my dear," said Grandma Ruth, holding Jessica's hands. "That boss of yours has no idea who he's dealing with. You've got the Bennett's blood running through your veins, and we never bow down to arrogant people." Jessica walked into the office with her heart pounding. She had managed to identify a few words in the contract, but was still far from a complete translation. Richard was waiting for her with the same mocking smile as the day before, surrounded by managers who were clearly there to witness the promised humiliation. "So, our little genius, did you crack the code?" he sneered, making the others laugh. "I managed to identify a few things," Jessica replied, keeping her voice steady despite her nerves. "There are few things. How specific? Do enlighten us, please. What are these mysterious discoveries?" Jessica took a deep breath and began explaining the characters she had learned to recognize. She mentioned the words contract and partnership, trying to explain how she had reached those conclusions, but Richard cut her off before she could finish. "That's ridiculous. Anyone could guess a business document talks about contracts. You're just throwing out random words." "I'm not guessing. If you give me more time, I can—" "Time? I said you had until this morning, and it's clear you've failed miserably." Humiliation burned in Jessica's cheeks. She knew Richard was right. She hadn't met the challenge as promised. But there was something else in his expression, an unease that didn't match the victory he should have been feeling. "Now, as promised, I want you to admit publicly that you're nothing more than an average employee who thinks too highly of herself." The words cut deep. Jessica felt the shame spreading through her body, but at the same time a rising anger took hold. This wasn't just about the translation challenge. It was about years of disdain, snide remarks, being treated as if she were invisible. "Mr. Coleman," she said, her voice stronger than she expected, "you're right. I didn't translate the whole document, but you couldn't either, could you?" Richard's smile vanished. The managers around them exchanged confused glances, unsure where Jessica was going with this. What are you implying? I'm saying if you knew what was written on that paper, you wouldn't need expensive translators. And judging by how nervous you got when I mentioned the word partnership, I'd say there's something in this contract that's worrying. You, Richard stepped forward, his face red with anger. You're crossing a line. How dare you question my business methods? I'm not questioning anything, just observing, and observing well. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Jessica knew she had stepped into dangerous territory, but something inside her refused to back down. There was power in this moment, a power she had never felt before. Richard snatched the document from the desk and quickly tucked it into his jacket pocket. This conversation is over. Get back to work, and I don't want another word about... Tess, what about the double salary you promised? Double? You failed the challenge, but I tried and I learned things you didn't expect me to know. That has to be worth something. Richard stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time. There was something new in his eyes, a reluctant respect mixed with irritation. You get a 10% raise. That's the most you'll get for attempting the impossible. It wasn't what had been promised, but it was more than Jessica had earned in years of silent work. She nodded and turned to leave, but Richard's voice stopped her. Jessica, where did you learn about Chinese characters? She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. There was genuine curiosity there, but also something that seemed almost fear. I learned from someone who knew how to teach, she replied, leaving the answer deliberately vague. Over the following days, Jessica noticed a subtle shift in Richard's behavior. He was still arrogant and demanding, but there was something different in the way he looked at her. Sometimes she caught him watching her work, as if trying to decipher a mystery. What she didn't know was that Richard was facing the biggest problem of his career. The Chinese contract he had used to humiliate her was actually a critical document for a deal that could make or break his company. His professional, translators had given conflicting interpretations, and he was desperate for a definitive answer. That Friday, Jessica was organizing the office papers when she found a forgotten copy of the contract in a drawer. This time, she studied it more carefully, applying everything she had learned from her grandmother. Slowly, some phrases began to make sense. She realized it wasn't just an ordinary business contract. There were references to properties, historical rights, and something about a specific family. The more she read, the more intrigued she became. Working late? A voice said behind her. Jessica turned, startled, and saw Richard standing in the office doorway. It was almost 8 at night, and she hadn't realized he was still in the building. I'm sorry, Mr. Coleman, I was just organizing the papers. Richard stepped closer and saw the contract on the desk. His expression immediately tensed. What are you doing with that? I found a copy in the drawer. I was trying to understand it better. And did you? Jessica hesitated. She had uncovered some important things, but she wasn't sure if she should share them. Richard looked genuinely worried, more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. A little. But I need more time to be sure. How much time? A week, maybe 2, and I'd need help. My grandmother knows more than I do. Richard sank heavily into a chair, running his hands through his hair. For a moment, he didn't seem like the powerful, arrogant businessman he usually was. He just looked like a worried man facing a problem bigger than he could handle alone. Jessica, I'll be honest with you. This contract is more important than you realize. If I don't fully understand it, I could lose everything I've built. The confession surprised her. Richard was admitting weakness, something she never thought she'd see. What exactly are you up against? The Chinese company is claiming my father made a deal with them 50 years ago, one that would force me to return properties worth millions today. But the details are all in this document, and I can't be sure what it really says. A chill ran through Jessica. 50 years ago, the same time her grandmother had worked for the Liu family. Could there be a connection? What if I can translate it? What happens to me? Richard looked her in the eye, and for the first time since they'd met, there was no arrogance in his expression. If you can help me solve this, I promise your life will change completely. It was a vague promise, but there was sincerity in his voice. Jessica felt she was at a crossroads. She could refuse, keep her simple, safe life, or take the challenge and risk everything for something greater. "All right," she said finally. "I'll try to help, but I have some conditions." "What are they?" "First, I want full transparency about what's going on. Second, my grandmother is part of the process. And third, if I solve the problem, I want a real promotion, not just a token raise." Richard extended his hand to her. "We have a deal." When Jessica got home that night, she found Grandma Ruth waiting for her with a mysterious smile. The elderly woman was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by more old documents she had pulled from the shoebox. "How did you know I'd need this?" Jessica asked, surprised. "A grandmother always knows, my dear. And besides, you weren't the first person to come to me today." "What do you mean?" "Your boss was here this afternoon." Jessica sank heavily into a chair, shocked. "Richard came here. How did he find out where we live?" "He asked for your address in HR. He came here humbly, asking for my help. He was very different from the arrogant man you described." "And what did you talk about?" Grandma Ruth smiled, her eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "We talked about the past, my granddaughter, and about how some stories have a way of repeating themselves in surprising ways." She opened one of the old documents on the table. "Did you know your boss's father, Mr. Coleman Sr., was partners with Mr. Liu 50 years ago?" Jessica felt like the floor had vanished beneath her feet. "That's impossible. How do you know this?" "Because I was there when they signed the agreement. I was the only one in the house who spoke English and Mandarin, so I served as the interpreter for the documents. What your Richard doesn't know is that there's a special clause in the contract, one that could save him from losing everything." The revelations came like waves, each more surprising than the last. Jessica tried to process the information, to understand how her life had become so intricately intertwined with Richard's. What kind of clause? A family protection clause. If the child of either partner could prove they uphold the values of honor and respect that their parents established, they would have the right to renegotiate the terms of the original agreement. And how does someone prove something like that? Grandma Ruth looked deeply into her granddaughter's eyes. By treating well those who depend on him, by recognizing people's worth regardless of their social standing, by showing humility in the face of knowledge, even when it comes from unexpected places. Jessica began to understand where her grandmother was going. Richard's test wasn't just about translation or business, it was about character, about the kind of person he truly was. "Grandma, what are you planning?" "I'm planning to give your boss the chance to prove he deserves the legacy his father left him, but he'll have to earn it the hard way." The next morning, Richard arrived at the office to find Jessica and Grandma Ruth waiting for him in the conference room. The elderly woman was dressed in her finest clothes, her hair carefully styled, and there was a dignity in her posture that made Richard immediately feel intimidated. "Mr. Coleman," said Grandma Ruth, standing to greet him, "my granddaughter told me about your situation. I'm here to help, but you need to understand one thing. The solution to your problem isn't just in translating this document." Richard sat down, visibly nervous in the older woman's presence. There was something about Grandma Ruth that commanded respect, an authority that came from decades of experience and wisdom. "Mrs. Ruth, I appreciate your willingness to help. Can you tell me what else I need to know? You need to understand that real business is done between people, not just between companies, and people need to trust one another." She opened the old document on the table. "This is the original contract your father signed with Mr. Liu. I was there when it happened. What the Chinese are bringing forward now is only part of the story." Richard looked at the yellowed paper, seeing for the first time the document that had shaped his family's destiny without him even knowing. "How is this possible?" "My father never told me about any deal with the Chinese, because your father was a proud man who made some mistakes late in life. When Mr. Liu left the United States abruptly, they didn't have a chance to settle some unfinished business. Your father carried that guilt to the end." Grandma Ruth pointed to a specific section of the document. "But look here. There's a clause stating that any future disputes should be resolved through cultural mediation, not just legal means. That means the solution depends on mutual understanding, on respecting the traditions of both cultures." "And what does that mean in practice? It means you need to prove you're worthy of the trust your father built. And that proof can't be bought or forced. It has to be shown through your actions. Richard looked at Jessica, who had stayed silent the whole time. There was something different in her eyes, a confidence he hadn't noticed before. Jessica, what do you think about all this? I think my grandmother is right, but I also think you need to decide what kind of person you want to be, regardless of business. The brutal honesty of her answer hit him like a punch. Richard realized he was being judged not just on his ability to solve the financial problem, but on his character as a person. What do you need from me? Grandma Ruth smiled, and Jessica saw in that smile the same determination that had shaped her own personality. We need you to learn Mandarin. What? If you want to settle this according to tradition, you need to be able to communicate directly with the Chinese representatives. No middlemen, no paid translators, just you showing respect for their culture. Richard looked like he was about to protest, but something in Grandma Ruth's steady gaze made him reconsider. How much time do I have? The Chinese representatives arrive in the United States in 6 weeks. If you can manage a basic conversation in Mandarin by then, and if you can show you understand and respect the traditions your father established, they might be willing to renegotiate. And if I can't, then you lose everything, and you deserve to lose, Jessica said, with a bluntness that surprised even herself. Richard spent the rest of the morning trying to process everything he'd just learned. His entire life had been built on the legacy his father left behind, but now he was discovering that legacy came with responsibilities he'd never imagined. That afternoon, he returned to the meeting room where Jessica and Grandma Ruth were waiting with a stack of books and documents. "Ready to get started?" he asked. "The question is, are you ready?" Grandma Ruth replied. "Because what we're about to teach you isn't just a language. It's a way of seeing the world, of understanding that every person has value no matter their position." The first lessons were a disaster. Richard, used to mastering any business-related subject quickly, grew frustrated with the difficulty of pronouncing Mandarin tones correctly. Grandma Ruth was a patient but demanding teacher, and Jessica became his assistant, translating concepts when needed. "It's not just about saying the right words," Grandma Ruth explained after Richard made the same mistake for the 10th time. "It's about respecting the learning process. You're trying to force the language to fit your haste, but languages don't work that way. I need to learn fast. I don't have time for philosophies." And that's exactly the attitude that could make you lose everything, Jessica shot back. "The Chinese value patience, respect for the process. If you show up rushed and arrogant, you'll confirm everything they already suspect about you." It was the first time she'd ever spoken to him so directly, and Richard felt a mix of irritation and admiration. There was strength in that woman, an intelligence he had completely underestimated. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, the following weeks established an odd routine. Every morning before his regular workday, Richard would meet with Jessica and Grandma Ruth for their Mandarin lessons. He had hired Jessica as his personal assistant, formalizing the time she dedicated to the project. But the dynamic between them was changing in ways neither had anticipated. "You're improving," Jessica admitted after a particularly productive session. "Your tone pronunciation is still terrible, but at least now you understand there's a difference." "Thanks, I guess," Richard replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "I never thought learning a language would be so humbling." "Welcome to the real world where not everything can be bought or bullied into submission," she said with a smile. It was strange how she had grown more confident these past weeks. The janitor's uniform had been replaced by clothes more suited to her new role, but it was more than that. There was a different posture, a way of speaking that revealed the intelligence that had always been there, just waiting for the chance to shine. "Jessica, can I ask you a personal question? You can try. Why did you never pursue a better career? It's obvious you're capable of so much more than cleaning." Her smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "Because not everyone is born with the same opportunities, Mr. Coleman. Some people have to work from an early age to help their families, And when you spend years being treated as invisible, you start to believe maybe you really are. The answer hit him like a slap in the face. Richard realized he had never truly considered the circumstances that shaped the lives of those around him. To him, success had always seemed like a matter of personal effort, but he was beginning to understand that the starting point made all the difference. "I'm sorry, I never thought about it that way. No need to apologize, just try to remember that when you're negotiating with the Chinese, they too have a history, a perspective you need to respect." By the fourth week of lessons, they received unsettling news. The Chinese representatives had moved up their arrival and would be in the United States in just 10 days. Richard panicked, feeling nowhere near ready for the crucial meeting. "I can't do this," he declared after a particularly difficult session. 10 days isn't enough to learn what I need to know." "You're right," Grandma Ruth agreed, surprising him. 10 days isn't enough to become fluent, but it might be enough to show respect and sincere intention." "How so?" "The Chinese don't expect you to be perfect in their language, but they do expect you to try, to show enough humility to step out of your comfort zone. Effort matters, more than perfection." Jessica nodded, adding her own perspective. "Besides, we'll be there with you. My grandmother can serve as a cultural mediator, and I can help with more complex translations. You're not alone in this." The offer of support touched him in an unexpected way. Richard was used to facing professional challenges surrounded by paid lawyers and consultants, but this was different. Jessica and Grandma Ruth were offering genuine help based on something he couldn't quite name yet. "Why are you doing this for me?" he asked, genuinely curious. Grandma Ruth and Jessica exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke of decades of shared life. "Because my granddaughter sees something in you worth saving," the elderly woman finally said. "And because I believe people can change, if they have the right motivation." Richard looked at Jessica, trying to understand what Grandma Ruth had seen. In her eyes, he found something unexpected, not just professional respect, but something deeper, more personal. "Jessica, what do you see in me?" She hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "I see someone who has the potential to be better than they are, someone who can choose to use their power to build rather than destroy. But you need to make that choice consciously." The words hung in the air between them, carrying a meaning that went far beyond the professional situation they had created. The last few days of preparation had been intense. Richard devoted himself to his lessons with a focus that impressed his teachers, and slowly began to hold basic conversations in Mandarin. More importantly, he started to understand some of the cultural concepts Grandma Ruth considered essential. "Remember," she said the night before the meeting, "the concept of face is fundamental in Chinese culture. It's not just about looking good, it's about maintaining mutual dignity. If you humiliate them or yourself, everyone loses. And how do I maintain dignity without seeming weak? By being honest about your limitations, but firm in your intentions. Acknowledge what you don't know, but make clear what you're willing to do to correct past mistakes." On the morning of the meeting, Richard woke before dawn, mentally reviewing everything he had learned. When he arrived at the office, he found Jessica and Grandma Ruth already waiting, both dressed formally for the occasion. "How do I look?" he asked, adjusting his tie nervously. "You're ready," Jessica said with conviction. "Not perfect, but ready, and that's what matters." The Chinese representatives arrived promptly at 10 in the morning. There were 3 of them. An elderly man who was clearly the leader, a middle-aged woman who appeared to be the legal expert, and a young man likely serving as the interpreter. They were led to the main conference room, where Richard waited with his 2 allies. "Mr. Liu," Richard said in Mandarin, greeting the group's leader, "it's an honor to welcome you to my company." The elderly man seemed surprised to hear his own language. He replied in Mandarin, speaking slowly to accommodate Richard's basic level. "Mr. Coleman, we're impressed by your effort to learn our language. It shows a respect we didn't expect." Grandma Ruth introduced herself in fluent Mandarin, explaining her historical connection to the original Liu family. The visitor's reaction was immediate and emotional. The group's leader stood and bowed respectfully to her. "You're the Ruth who worked for my grandfather?" he asked, his voice a mix of surprise and emotion. "Yes, I am. And this is my granddaughter, Jessica, who has been helping Mr. Coleman understand the responsibilities he inherited from his father." The dynamic of the meeting shifted completely. What had begun as a potentially hostile negotiation turned into a conversation about family history, about connections that spanned generations. Richard watched in fascination as Grandma Ruth skillfully navigated between the two cultures. "Mr. Liu," Richard said, carefully choosing his words in Mandarin, "I know my father made mistakes. I can't undo the past, but I want to honor the spirit of the original agreement." "And how do you propose to do that?" asked the legal expert. Richard took a deep breath. This was the crucial moment when all their preparation would be tested. "I propose establishing a true partnership based on the principles our fathers set. Not just a business relationship, but a cultural collaboration that benefits both communities," he continued, explaining in his mix of Mandarin and English how he envisioned this partnership working. He spoke about creating cultural exchange programs, establishing educational connections between the United States and China, and honoring the memory of the pioneers who had built the first bridges between the two countries. Jessica translated when needed, but Richard was doing better than anyone had anticipated. Most importantly, his sincerity was evident even through the language barriers. "Mr. Coleman," said the Chinese leader after a long pause, "what you're proposing goes far beyond the legal terms of the original contract." Richard felt his heart race. Was this a sign of rejection? "But," the elderly man continued, "it's exactly the kind of vision my grandfather would have approved of. He always said the best deals are those where everyone wins." The tension in the room dissipated like a cloud dispersing. The Chinese began discussing among themselves in rapid Mandarin, occasionally asking questions that Grandma Ruth translated. Richard realized he wasn't just negotiating a contract, he was being evaluated as a person. "We have a proposal," the legal expert finally said. "We're willing to renegotiate the original terms, but with specific conditions." "What conditions?" "First, we want Mrs. Ruth to be our official cultural representative in the United States. Second, we want Miss Jessica to coordinate the exchange programs you mentioned. And third, we want quarterly meetings to ensure the partnership's principles are upheld." Richard looked at Jessica and Grandma Ruth, seeing a mix of surprise and satisfaction on their faces. They had been recognized not just as intermediaries, but as essential partners in the deal. "I accept all the conditions," he said without hesitation. The next 2 hours were spent defining the practical details of the new agreement. Richard realized that far from losing assets, he was gaining far more valuable business opportunities. The partnership with the Chinese would open doors to markets he'd never imagined accessing. When the representatives finally left, Richard found himself alone in the meeting room with Jessica and Grandma Ruth. The silence that followed was heavy with relief, but also with the understanding that everything had changed. "I can't believe—" "We pulled this off," he said finally. "You pulled it off," Jessica corrected. "We just showed the way." "No, that's not true. I never would have come close to solving this alone. You saved me." Grandma Ruth stood to leave but paused at the door. "Richard," she said, using his first name for the first time, "remember that saving someone is easy. The hard part is for that person to remain worthy of being saved." When they were alone, Richard and Jessica looked at each other for a long moment. There was so much to say, so much to process, that neither knew where to begin. "Jessica, I need to ask you something." "What?" "Why did you really help me? Don't give me the diplomatic answer. Tell me the truth." She walked to the window, gazing at the city below. Richard could see her reflection in the glass, her thoughtful expression, as if searching for the right words. "Because I saw in you the same thing my grandmother saw in Mr. Liu 50 years ago. Wasted potential. Kindness, buried under layers of arrogance and fear. And because I believe good people deserve the chance to be better." "And do you think I'm a good person?" "I think you can be, if you choose to be." Richard stepped closer to her, stopping at a respectful distance, but near enough to see his reflection alongside hers in the window. "Jessica, I need to confess something to you. Over these past few weeks working with you, getting to know your grandmother, learning about your story, I've realized my whole life was built on very shaky foundations. What do you mean? I always thought success meant having power over others, more money, more influence. But you've shown me that true success is when you can use what you have to help others become better too. Jessica turned to face him, and Richard saw tears glistening in her eyes. Richard, you need to understand this change can't just be about gratitude for what we've done. It has to be because you truly want to be a different person. I do. For the first time in my life, I really want to be better, and I want you to help me on this journey. As your employee? As my partner, in every sense. The words came out before he could stop them, heavy with a meaning that surprised them both. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the arrival of Grandma Ruth, who had returned to fetch a forgotten bag. "Sorry to interrupt," the elderly woman said with a knowing smile. "But Richard, may I offer some advice?" "Of course, Mrs. Ruth. Be patient. The best things in life need time to grow properly. My granddaughter spent years being underestimated. She deserves time to adjust to the idea that someone finally sees her true worth." Richard nodded, understanding the wisdom behind her words. He had spent weeks learning about patience and respecting the process. Now he needed to apply those lessons to the most important situation of his life. In the months that followed, Richard's company transformed in ways no one had anticipated. The partnership with the Chinese brought not just financial success, but a new business philosophy based on collaboration rather than domination. Jessica officially took on the role of Director of Cultural Relations, a position created specifically for her. Her first initiative was establishing a scholarship program for employees who wanted to learn foreign languages, especially Mandarin. "Are you trying to create an entire company of bilingual people?" Richard asked during one of their regular meetings. "I'm trying to create a company of people who understand the world is bigger than they imagined," Jessica replied. "When you learn a new language, you learn a new way of thinking." Richard smiled, remembering how that lesson had transformed his own perspective. The relationship between them continued to evolve slowly. Richard kept his word about being patient, but it was obvious to everyone around them that something special was growing between them. They worked well together, naturally complementing each other's skills. Grandma Ruth became a respected figure in the company, serving as a cultural advisor for new international projects. She had set up a small office where she met with employees, facing personal struggles, offering wisdom gathered over 75 years of life. "How's Jessica?" she asked Richard during one of their weekly conversations. "She's blossoming. That's the only word I can find. It's like she's becoming the person she always was inside." "And you?" "Me, I'm still learning. Every day I discover something new about how to be a better person. It's harder than I imagined, but also more rewarding." "And when are you going to stop pretending what you feel for my granddaughter is just professional?" The direct question made Richard laugh. Grandma Ruth had a gift for cutting to the heart of things in a way that left no room for evasion. "When I'm sure I deserve whatever feelings she might have for me." "Richard, my son, you're wasting time waiting for a perfection that will never come. True love isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to grow together." Her words echoed in Richard's mind for days afterward. He watched Jessica working, saw the passion she poured into projects, the way she treated everyone with genuine respect, and felt something growing inside him that went far beyond professional admiration. The decisive moment came during the 6-month celebration of their partnership with the Chinese. The company had organized a cultural event with traditional Chinese and American dance performances, food from both countries, and speeches about the importance of international collaboration. Richard had prepared a special speech for the occasion, but when it was his turn to speak, he found himself looking directly at Jessica in the audience and decided to improvise. "6 months ago," he began, "I was a man who believed I knew everything. About business, about success, about what truly mattered in life. I was completely wrong." He told the story of how it all began, from the arrogant translation challenge to the realization that his salvation would come from the very people he had spent years ignoring. "I learned that true success isn't about how much money you have. But how many people become better for having crossed your path? I learned that intelligence has nothing to do with degrees or social status. And I learned that life's greatest opportunities come disguised as challenges that first humble us. When he finished, the applause was warm, but Richard only had eyes for Jessica. She was crying but smiling at the same time, and in that moment, he knew he couldn't wait any longer. After the event, he found her on the building's terrace where she had gone for a moment of peace. "Jessica, your speech was beautiful," she said without turning. "Very honest." "I'm not done being honest yet." She turned to face him, curious. "Jessica Bennett, you've changed my life in every possible way. You taught me humility, showed me what really matters, made me want to be someone worth knowing. And somewhere along this journey, I fell in love with you." She opened her mouth to respond, but he continued. "I know we started in very different places. I know I still have a lot to prove about the kind of man I can be. But I also know I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the extraordinary woman you are." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Jessica studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching for sincerity in every line of his face. "Richard," she finally said, "are you sure you're not mistaking? Gratitude for love. I'm sure that what I feel for you started long before you saved me. It started the moment you refused to bow to my arrogance. You intrigued me, challenged me, made me question everything about myself. That's not gratitude, that's love." Jessica stepped closer, placing her hand on his cheek with a tenderness that made Richard's heart race. "I fell for you too," she confessed, "but not for the man you were, for the man you were becoming, for the way you chose to change, for the humility you found, for the person you decided to be. So, do you want to try? Build something real together?" "I do, but on one condition." "What?" "That you promise never to stop growing, that even when things get easy, you'll keep choosing to be better." "I promise. And Jessica, thank you." "For what?" "For seeing in me something worth saving." They kissed there on the terrace, with New York City stretching around them like a sea of lights. It was the end of one journey, but the beginning of another, one they would take together. 2 years later, Richard and Jessica stood on the same terrace, but this time as husband and wife. The ceremony had been simple, focused on family and close friends, with Grandma Ruth serving as their special matron of honor. The company had become a model of corporate social responsibility, known not only for its financial success, but for how it treated its employees and contributed to the community. Jessica had established education programs that helped people from humble backgrounds develop their skills, creating opportunities where there had once only been barriers. "Do you remember the day it all began?" Richard asked, holding his wife close. "When you challenged me to translate that contract." "How could I forget? I was trying to humiliate you, but I ended up saving my own life." "No, you saved yourself. I just showed you the way. And now? Now we keep walking together forever." Grandma Ruth watched them from the living room, a satisfied smile on her face. At 77, she had seen her granddaughter find not only love but recognition for all she had always been. And she had seen an arrogant man transform into someone worthy of loving her girl. "Mission accomplished," she murmured to herself, raising a cup of tea in a silent toast. The future stretched before Richard and Jessica, full of possibilities. They had learned that the best love stories aren't about two perfect people finding each other, but about two imperfect people choosing to grow together, supporting each other on the journey to becoming the best versions of themselves. And it had all started with an arrogant challenge and a document in Mandarin that changed 3 lives forever. The end. Now tell us what you thought of this story of transformation and perseverance. Did Richard truly change, or do you think people like him can slip back into old habits? And Jessica, did she make the right choice by giving love a chance? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this one.